casa. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz. I'm a philosopher here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon, and I'm a philosopher at the University of Texas at El Paso. And today we're really happy to have with us a colleague of ours, Nuno Fonseca, who is currently an integrated researcher at the NOVA Institute of Philosophy, and within the Culturelab coordinates the Aesthetics and Philosophy of Art Research Group. He explores various topics in this domain: aesthetic experience, concepts, and values, both in the context of the arts, where he focuses mainly on sound art, and in the context of urban and everyday life aesthetics. At the same time, he continues his research on the Port Royal's logic, being the author of its first Portuguese full translation. Since 2012, he has taught at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of the NOVA University Lisbon courses on rhetoric and argumentation, art and experience, and several short courses on the philosophy of sounds and sound art, as well as modules dedicated to logic, epistemology, and aesthetics. Since 2021, he co-teaches the course Urban Aesthetics, Philosophy, Art, and the City, offered in the international curriculum of the faculty. With a degree in law from 1998 and philosophy from 2004 from the University of Coimbra, he completed his PhD in philosophy in the areas of epistemology and philosophy of knowledge at NOVA FCSH in 2012, working on issues related to mental and pictorial representation and perception. Besides other national and international publications, he has co-edited the volumes Morphology, Questions on Method and Language, Conceptual Figures of Fragmentation and Reconfiguration, Planos de Pormenor, A Cidade nas Práticas Artísticas, and is preparing a collective book, Rethinking the City, Reconfiguration and Fragmentation, be published at Routledge during 2024, which is coming up. Since the 90s, he's been dealing with sound and sound experience, namely through the conception and direction of radio shows at RUC, and more recently, the National Public Radio, but also been involved in sound design for theater and performance shows. Welcome to our show, Nuno.
Well, thank you. Hello, and let me say that I'm very happy to be part of this show and this program, and I'm also honored to be invited to talk about these issues that are part of my academic life, but also my life in general. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, I would like to just get started right off the bat and get going. You mentioned before we started recording that you haven't thought about the concept of beauty in some time. And so that's been our focal point for this whole year. We've been working on the borders between what is beautiful and how we define beauty, and if there's borders to how we experience beauty, what's beauty, what's not beauty, what's ugly, and aesthetic experience. But we'll get to the aesthetics, which is the more general category. But first, we want to ask you, what do you think about beauty, and how does that show up in your work life or your daily life?
Okay, so it's a very apparently simple question and a very, very difficult question to answer, because the concept of beauty or the beautiful, and I will probably distinguish the two from a personal perspective. But it's a very broad concept, both because it has a very, very long history, of course, but also because it is related and sometimes, I think, confused not in a wrong way, but it includes many other concepts. So it may mean like the general aesthetic value. So we call beauty to everything that gives us some kind of aesthetic pleasure. But of course, I would even say that it is more than a concept. It's like a conceptual order or conceptual cluster, a manifold of very of many interrelated concepts and meanings. So, of course, it has meant, since the ancient Greeks, something more like an objective kind of beauty related to certain properties like symmetry, harmony, proportion, even perfection. And all these are part of a whole, of course. But I think that since the 17th or the 18th century, let's say since modernity, the beauty, or what I would now call the beautiful, has a more subjective meaning. So it is more related to the effect of an experience. We experience something through the senses. I'm not saying that the beauty of the Greeks were not related to senses, of course. There was also this sensual element, but beauty was more like an ideal, a universal, an universal concept, like the good or the truth or the justice. And after modernity, or after the 18th century, when aesthetics more properly emerged, people were discussing things like, I find this is beautiful. Why should you think this is also beautiful, for instance? And in this sense, it has more like a subjective meaning. And here, subjective means that it is related to an experience. So instead of being this thing that everyone knows what it is, here it is open to discussion. And this is how maybe aesthetics started, because we wanted to talk about these different kinds of experiences. Of course, beauty or the beautiful, and the distinction could be what I just mentioned, that beauty, I usually write it with a capital B, beauty, because it is this universal idea. And the beautiful is more written with a lowercase b, because it is related to something that we experience here in the world, and each one has a different kind of experience. A very big concept, of course, and it's endless because there are other meanings that are related. I mentioned harmony, proportion, but it can also be related to a certain kind of energy or a shining. For instance, in the Middle Ages, it was connected to color. For instance, color was almost a synonym of beauty, because it is something that emerges from what we can see or we can experience. And of course, there are other meanings that we probably can discuss, like aptness. At a certain point, it was something that fitted what fitted in a certain circumstance. What we could call beauty or beautiful, and in this sense, the word in Latin was decorum. So it was something that was part and belonged to something. That's another different meaning of it. Of course, there's also the moral beauty. I imagine that we can talk about this connection with the good, but well, it's a possibility. I don't know.
I would like to go back and ask you to tell us more about aesthetics, because it's a little bit of a fancy word. What does aesthetic mean?
Well, I would start with aesthetics, which is already very difficult to tell, but there's a history to this word aesthetics. Of course, people who study philosophy know that as a philosophical discipline, it emerges sort of in the middle of the 18th century, because a German philosopher, Alexander Baumgarten, invented a substantivized version of the word aesthesis, which was aesthetica, and he named this discipline that was focused on knowledge that derived from sensorial perception. So aesthetics would be the science of sensorial cognition. In this sense, I would say that is part of epistemology, even though then the word was not used. They used the word gnoseologia. And even in the definition of aesthetics that Baumgarten gives, he talks about gnoseologia inferior, this inferior kind of knowledge. But inferior here means, well, of course, it is related to some kind of hierarchy between the concepts that are clear, that are distinct, that we can understand through our intelligence. And there is also the things that we can know through our senses. And this kind of knowledge is more obscure, more indistinct. And aesthetics is, of course, focused on this relation to the world through the senses. We are not absolutely sure. We cannot grasp it into under a clear concept. But we know that sometimes some things are accurate, they are right, they belong there. There is, of course, the French expression je ne sais quoi that was used in the 17th century and the 18th century. I learned recently that it came from Petrarch, the Italian poet, no so che, and it means something that we don't know exactly what it is, but we feel it. So aesthetics is, of course, related also to an emotional experience. So I started to say that it came from a theory of knowledge, is a kind of knowledge, but it is also a kind of emotional experience. And of course, other philosophers show this very well, like Immanuel Kant. They showed us that when we talk about the beautiful or the beauty, we have a kind of experience that is emotional, that gives us some kind of pleasure. And this pleasure also emerges from something that is working in our minds between two faculties, understanding and imagination. He talks about the free play of imagination and understanding, and it is this movement of the mind that produces this sort of pleasure that we feel. So it's a complex thing, but I would say that aesthetics is focused on the things that we may experience through perception, through sensorial perception, but there is also an affective element, an emotional element to this kind of experience. And in the third place, but not the least, there is also imagination that helps us to produce meaning from this kind of experience. We are driven to try to know more, to try to make it meaningful from this kind of experience. So maybe it was a confused answer because it is also a very broad area, but aesthetics started like this. Of course, there is an historical evolution to aesthetics. And I think that, for instance, during the 19th century, it got confused with another philosophical discipline, with a philosophy of art. We usually talk about the two as if they were the same. But I think that we should, if we want to be very precise, separate the two philosophical disciplines, because aesthetics has a central concept, which is aesthetic experience. And aesthetic experience is pervasive in life. It happens in the realm of the arts, but we can also have aesthetic experience when we are in nature, of course, and even in our daily life, or walking through a city. We know, I know Jules from this concept of the philosophy of the city, and of course there is an urban aesthetics also. And philosophy of art is concerned with an area of human activity, which is art and the production of special artifacts that can bring us aesthetic experiences, but the focus is on this kind of activity, the creation of these works. They don't have to be artifacts. I mentioned artifacts, but they can be performances, they can be pieces of music. And so the questions that we make in the philosophy of art could be related to ontology, the ontology of work of art, or the sociology of the production, or the distribution, or even the reception of art. So these are very different questions than the questions in aesthetics, even though, of course, these two disciplines are mingled together, and the most intense and most interesting aesthetic experiences happen in the realm of the arts. I am just making a theoretical separation, but in life, everything belongs together in a certain sense.
I would like to follow up, Nuno. If someone is having if you're having a really good conversation with your son, right, or with your daughter, if you're having a really good cup of coffee, if you have a warm blanket, a baby, who has a warm blanket that smells good, I think if your dog comes or your cat, comes up to you and gives you a kiss, to me, those are aesthetic experiences that everyone has, right? And so why do you think aesthetics seems to be so, even art, sometimes it's so far away from the everyday experience? It's almost like this is accessible to everyone all the time, but then for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, it's almost like art is what you go see at the theater, at the opera, in the museum. Why that disconnection between the experience that the average person has or can have and an art behind, far away from, almost exclusive to certain people only?
Well, maybe there are several kinds of answers also to this question, because there's a history and there's a culture and a tradition that make us think that aesthetic experience has to be something special and something that is completely outstanding and comes out of the ordinary. I don't think it does. It has to be like this, but we have this idea that it has to be special. And of course, in our, at least in our Western tradition, art is what we think is as a job, as a function, and the function is to produce the possibility of having aesthetic experiences. And of course, I think that artists, when they are creating something, they are indeed working with their own aesthetic experiences, their ordinary or even not so ordinary aesthetic experiences, and they are problematizing them, they are intensifying them, and they are reconfiguring their own aesthetic experiences into something else. And when they do this, they create something that may become universal. So everyone can relate to this kind of experience because it went through this process of reconfiguration, for instance. And because if it was only the fact of trying to tell the personal experience, well, it could be a start. But when they reconfigure it, they give it a new form, or new forms in general, they make it something much more concrete, also more intense, maybe, because there is a lot that is in this simple artwork, and it doesn't have to be an object. It can be a performance, of course, or a happening. But I think it's why we usually find it easier to focus on these kinds of objects, because now we know, well, now I am going to have an aesthetic experience. It is not a given that we are going to have real aesthetic experiences. Actually, often people go to museums and they don't have aesthetic experiences at all, because they are just walking by and not paying attention. Actually, the word attention and the concept of attention is very, very important in all aesthetic experiences, because we have a special kind of attention that is focusing on something, not necessarily only on art. I don't know if I answered this or if I complicated the issue.
Thank you.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
You've given us a wonderful expose of the philosophy of and a history of and cultural awareness of not only beauty, but aesthetic experience in general, Nuno. But I want to get a little bit more particular now and ask you about the area in which you are particularly focused, and that's sound design and sound experience. So can you give us do you like have some examples of, say, the way you work with sound on an everyday basis or on an exemplary basis that would be related to beauty, or and in what way does the way you work with sound, do you have a certain aesthetic orientation to that? So a twofold kind of question. I may have complicated it too much, but
yes.
I want you to talk about sound.
Yes. I love to talk about sound. I love
beautiful sounds. I mean, you said you can experience beauty in a performance, or in something that fits, or so. Talk about sound. Go ahead.
Yes, I will talk about sound, and I will talk about a very well-known piece of sound art that almost everyone knows. That is a piece conceived by John Cage, the American composer, which is the 4 minutes and 33 seconds. When he presented this piece, let's call it like this, some people thought that he was joking or that it was a prank or something, because this piece apparently doesn't have sound. Just to resume, it's a piece of 4 minutes and 33 seconds where usually a musician is in front of a piano, and for this amount of time, he doesn't play the piano. So people are waiting for him to play, but he doesn't play. But this is not the point of the piece. The point of the piece is the sounds that surrounds the audience and the musician. So what he was focused on was in making people pay attention to what surrounds them and listening to the sounds that we usually don't find that they are beautiful, because people coughing or people talking or doing some kind of noise. But if we pay attention to these sounds and if we accept them, we slowly may find some kind of beauty in these sounds. So beauty in sound can mean a lot of things. If we are listening to a piece of music, we are probably waiting for a relation between certain kinds of frequencies that we call consonances, notes of music, harmony, or a sequence of notes, and we will find that they are melodic. But personally, I'm very focused on the material quality of each sound, what we usually call timbre, the quality of the sound. So it's like the colors of the sounds. What makes it a specific sound of a trombone or a cello or the voice, the human voice? Each human voice is very different, and that may be beautiful because if we delve deep inside the morphology of the sound, we can find beautiful things about them. Of course, sounds are also very interesting for the fact that they are ephemeral. Most people think that they can listen to the same sound several times if it is recorded. But I would say that each sound can only be heard only once. We can only hear the sound once because the sound is something, it's an happening, it's an event. It's something that emerges in time, has a certain duration, and then vanishes, and it vanishes forever. And when I say this, it sounds like I'm joking, because of course we can record sound, and we can repeat it, we can reproduce the sound, but each time that we are reproducing sound, we are making this sound again. It's not the same sound that I heard yesterday, for instance. And this ephemerality of sound is also maybe something that makes it beautiful, because one of the characteristics of beauty may be the fact that it is fleeting. It appears and it may vanish. The French poet Charles Baudelaire was almost obsessed with ephemeral beauty. Even in the middle of ugly things, he wanted to try to find this ephemeral beauty. The fact that it is so ephemeral, so fragile, also makes it beautiful, I think. And actually, just let me add this, and this is not related to sound now, but I found recently that the words in Latin that we translate as beauty or beautiful started to be pulchrum in the ancient Rome. And after the Renaissance, we started to use bellum. But the word bellum comes from good, from bonum. And actually they derive because at a certain point, people started to use a diminutive of bonum, bonellum. And bonellum was referring to children or to women, and to small things. And after this bonellum, it derived to bellum. And after the Renaissance, we started to use the word bellum that derived in beauté, beautiful, beauty, etc. And I find this interesting because in the 18th century, for instance, Burke, when he wrote about the ideas of the beautiful and of the sublime, he related the beautiful things to the small things, the things that are somehow fragile, and against the sublime things that were huge or very powerful, very intense. And it's interesting that there is this relationship with the small things, the fragile things. Of course, there are different meanings of the word beautiful that are not related to the small or to the cute or the good things. But I think this was interesting to find out.
Along those lines about the small things, and you introduced Cage, right?
Yes.
John Cage and his work. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was out of the many things you mentioned, Nuno,
Sorry.
was the way we pay attention to the experiences that we're having. And it seems as though one of the things that Cage does is he in his works and his performance art and his work with sound, he gets us to think about the way that we're not listening to the life that we're living.
Yes.
And in some ways, I don't know, this may be going too far, but in some ways it's there's like this bigger purpose for what he's doing, connecting with what you're saying about the small things, right? That in some ways, when we pay better attention to what we're doing, when we listen to the sounds of the small things in our lives and all the different layers and diversity, then our life becomes more musical somehow.
Yes, that's
or it makes better sense, or I then experience the beauty of this fabulous composition called my life, or something like that. If I learn to pay better attention or something.
I totally agree, and I should have mentioned something that is even probably more important, because one of the ideas behind what John Cage was doing was that when we stop and when we start to listen, we let the sounds be themselves. So instead of imposing a structure, for instance, this idea of the musical note, a do, a re, a or c, in English you use the letters, but instead of imposing a musical structure that we call the musical note, a certain tone, we should instead let the sound be itself. And so listen to what it is, and not trying to find what we think that we know in the sound. So instead of trying to use musical notes, it was trying to let the sounds be in themselves. And this is very interesting, because once we become silent ourselves and pay attention, one of the instructions in the musical score of the only instruction actually was tacet. In Latin means you don't play any instrument now, you silence, you make you keep quiet. And if we keep quiet, it is the condition to listen. We are able to listen when we are not producing noise. And when we start to listen and let the sounds be themselves, we also participate in this kind of event that is the emergence of sound. If we pay due attention to it, I think that we also become part of this life, this flux of life that is going on. And I think that was essential even for what we now call sound. It is probably the inaugural moment, even if there were other artists previously that were already working with sounds. For instance, Edgar Varese, the French-American composer, he was already also working with sounds that he called music. He called organized sound. But Cage tried to disorganize it to let the sounds be themselves. And I think this attitude is very important for us to also be part of what is happening in the world, and let the world be. It's also related to the Zen philosophy, of course.
Yeah,
I'm not a specialist, but I think it is related to that.
Yeah, no, I heard that coming through.
I want to jump in on that, actually. I have a comment related and then a question. And the comment is from Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. I'm sure you know about him. he talks about the difference between noise and sound. And the way that he explains it is if a blue jay is standing on your roof, squawking, and noise is when we're bothered by the squawking, but sound is if we listen, pay attention, listen. And he says, then the bird will come into your heart and you become the blue jay. And you are outside.
Well, I can only
right?
Say that I am absolutely in tune with this position, because yes, the difference between sometimes noise and musical sound is also a question of attitude towards the sound that we are listening. In fact, for instance, in French, the word bruit, that means noise, is simply the word for sound. So it doesn't have this negative element, even though, of course, we also use it in the negative sense. But a bruit is simply a sound. So we can learn to listen to these noises and make them eventually musical, or we can decide that we are bothered by it and we are against it and we should remove it from our world. But having said this, of course, there are actual noises. If we produce a sound with a negative intention, if we produce a sound to prevent others from showing their own voices, we are doing noise. Noise in this sense that we are preventing others to express themselves, for instance. So we can still use the word noise in a negative sense if we are dealing also with this more ethical attitude of using or producing sound. But in general, I agree with what you said.
So then the ethical part, and I want to give one more example before I go into the ethical, was this gentleman who was rented an apartment, but the woman that rented the apartment to him said, it's this much money, and the only bad thing about it is that there's a playground underneath in the schoolyard, and the kids are so loud. And so then he's like, okay. So he moves in, and then the kids, of course, start playing and making their children screaming and laughing, playing. And he says, it's the best thing. It's the best thing about the apartment. You get to hear, and you become a child again, right? From that energy. So you mentioned bellum was the root of the word of beauty, but isn't it also the root of the word for war?
Oh, yes, but I think it has a different etymology. But yes, bellus is also the word from war, but it is not related, because this bellum derives from the diminutive of bonum, bonellum, and from the evolution of.
Other way.
Yes. So they are different words, even if they are similar. They have different meanings.
Yeah, it's interesting, like bellicose.
Yes.
All those, the root of the word still seems to be related. Why is it? Because the root of the word and the concept, when I teach logic, I'll know that, right? When I teach logic and I teach the difference between a valid argument, validity and truth,
Mhm.
and that soundness. At the very beginning, when I explained that a valid argument doesn't necessarily need to be true. So many of our students are confused, including myself when I first learned about validity. And I personally think it's because we have this conglomerate of good, beautiful, therefore valid. It's all one thing.
Yes.
And then it's not until you start thinking critically about what does good mean, and is good beautiful, and is that valid, and they're actually different things, not necessarily related to each other, right? So why do you think we tend to have this conglomerate?
Well, again, I think that there is a history to this conglomerate that comes from the Greeks, as everything else, but mostly because during the Middle Ages, there was this tradition of talking about the divine, about God, with certain kinds of words, concepts that were attributes of the divine: goodness, truthfulness, being just and true, and at some point also beautiful. And I think that these attributes are different facets, different aspects of the same reality. So they are the summum bonum or the summum bellum of reality. And they were called the transcendentals, of course, these names of the divine. And I think there was this confusion between these different avatars of the image of God, and they remained for some amount of time. And we have this tendency to put beauty in the top of the hierarchy of the aesthetic, the good in the top of the hierarchy of the ethical, and as if everything in reality was going towards the same kind of super sensible reality. Maybe this is one of the reasons that we sometimes confuse all these terms, because we are different towards the same reality from different perspectives. For instance, we talk about a beautiful thing, and if it is beautiful, it is good. This I don't think that this is absolutely necessary. That there are things that may be good and that they are not necessarily beautiful. And I could give a simple example. I can take a pill that is good for my health, and I will not say that it is beautiful, and it is good in a certain sense. But usually, everything that we find beautiful gives us some kind of pleasure, and in this sense, we probably say that it is good for us. But if we are too focused on something that is beautiful because it is beautiful, maybe we exceed this measure of the good. If we are too focused on the beautiful for itself, for it being beautiful, we probably start to be excessive in relation to this thing and forget that there should be an ethical dimension. The same may happen on the wrong side. If we are too focused on being always doing the right thing, only thinking about the ethical part of life, maybe we forget that there are also other things in life that make it worth it, and forget that there is beauty in the world. I don't know. That's my take on this issue.
To keep in line with the sound connection. It's kind of like you don't have a symphony if you're just playing one instrument.
Exactly.
You need to have multiple dimensions of our experience for everything to come together.
Yes.
And harmonize as a whole. So at least along those lines, you have to have a good balance of the strings and the horns and the percussion and maybe the piano or whatever. But we need all these kinds of different expressions of sound and listening. In order to have the fullness of our aesthetic experience, and then it's beautiful.
Yes, yes. The beautiful is also related to this harmony of that we may find in the symphonic expression, and also this. When you were talking about the symphony, I started to think about the fact that there may also be a social aesthetics. We may find an aesthetic pleasure in doing things together, in going along with the same rhythm, for instance, and train ourselves in a certain rhythm. And when I say this, I'm thinking of working together into producing something, doing a collective artwork. Nowadays, it's very common in contemporary art to do work that is participatory. So we have participatory ways of producing artworks. We also have what a French art critic called relational aesthetics. So produce situations where we are together doing something, and what is aesthetic about this and what is creative about this is being together, producing, being listening to each other, being feeling some kind of empathy, or being attentive to the resonance that we may produce into each other. And this would be the relational aesthetic experience, which is probably connected to this idea of the social aesthetics. Actually, there is an American philosopher, Arnold Berliant, that has been writing about social aesthetics recently. And I found this very, very stimulating, because he's talking about this possibility of thinking about social situations with an aesthetic frame of mind. And there are, of course, situations where we are together and we can find aesthetic aspects to this being together, working together, producing something together, respecting each other, dialoguing, for instance. We can be conversating, having a conversation, and find aesthetic aspects to this conversation. And I think that's what we are doing here. We are letting ourselves express ourselves, express our ideas, also try to find a certain rhythm to our questions and answers. Sometimes this is more confusing in my part, because English is not my native language, but I think that we can still find a certain kind of aesthetics to this activity that we are having.
Well, maybe in terms of sound, Kim can practice her Portuguese with you. It will be even more symphonically aligned.
I want to give a shout out to our colleague Goyo Papas. Also, he's a music critic, He's a philosopher. He's an American pragmatist, Latin American philosopher, and a music critic. And he has also written about jazz and democracy. And right, so it's this idea, just very roughly, that we need each other, right? We need each other, and we're very different from each other, but everybody has a moment to speak, and it's not just one. It's just not the horns dominating the whole time, right? It's every instrument, like Jules mentioned, has their moment, and together we draw on each other's strengths, right? To create harmony, to have, for it to be aesthetic, right? And we actually we're wrapping up. This has come so quickly. The time that we've spent together. We only have about actually like 4 more minutes left, and so I wanted to ask Nuno if Nuno has any questions for Jules, for me, other comments that we haven't talked about, other ideas.
If I have questions, this is interesting. Yes, I have many kinds of questions. For instance, I would like to know from both of you, how do you place aesthetic experience in your daily life, for instance? Where do you find it? Where do you find it in El Paso, where I've never been? And how can it contribute to your sense of the beautiful, for instance?
I can go real quick. I think. So my dissertation is called Radical Democracy. It was on radical democracy, and Gregory was my advisor. And in previous lifetimes, I was a musician and a dancer, and then a martial artist. And so I have some sense for beauty, but to me, it's in the immediate experience I'm having with others, right? Or again, just having a cup of coffee and petting my dog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my response to that could be a bit more convoluted, because at the beginning of our dialogue, Kim mentioned that I'd probably be referring to Rosenzweig, so I will take an opportunity to do that here. And so my dissertation was called Relational Ethics, and I was really pleased to hear you talking about relational aesthetics, Nuno. Because it's in line exactly with the way I think about our daily lives, and kind of the core intention of Rosenzweig's book, The Star of Redemption, was to convey this sense of a relational aesthetics and how that's tied up with a relational ethics. At least that's my interpretation of it. And his approach, or his choice for demonstrating that, was to talk about, so he has at the core of his work a whole philosophy of music and a philosophy of art. And he talks about harmony and rhythm and counterpoint and things like that. But he gives us an image of two people singing together, like this in the Song of Songs, in Shir HaShirim, the Jewish Song of Songs passage from the Bible. But he also then follows that up with a kind of a social dimension. And that the way to think about our social relations is to think about them like a choir. And in a choir, everybody has to have their own moment or their own way, their own contribution that comes from their own voice. And harmony, and for the whole song to work, for the rhythm the harmony and the rhythm and the melody all to come together, one has to learn how to respect those differences of people's expression of their sound and their voices. And so I look for that in my daily life, you know, and I try to listen to the sounds of others and their perspective, because if I do that, then you know, my life is going to be more harmonious and more musical, so to speak.
Well,
and I do that with Kim walking our dog, you know, to come back to her, you know, to her reference. We carry on these kind of musical conversations with each other, walking and talking, listening, and you know, walking the streets of El Paso, which we do every day, twice a day, with our dog.
Well, I thank you for letting me be part of this conversation and for inviting me to this program. And it was a pleasure for me and an honor to talk with you about these issues. I believe that we could be talking here for many more hours. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Nuno, for joining us and having an aesthetic experience with us.
Yeah.
So my name is Kim Diaz, philosopher here at EPCC. This has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera.
Just quickly, I'm looking forward to having an aesthetic experience with you in Madrid, Nuno, in the near future.
We will, for sure.
Yeah, my name is Jules Simon, and philosopher from University of Texas, El Paso, and Nuno Fonseca, our guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Please join us next time.